How does a man with no training, no money, and no future become the most feared puncher in combat sports and still choose to walk away when power finally arrives?
Francis Ngannou's story begins far from cameras, far from cages, and far from choice. In Batié, Cameroon, life is simple in the cruelest way. You work or you disappear. As a child, Ngannou worked in sand mines, digging with his hands under a sun that offered no mercy. There was no talk of greatness, no backup plan, no inspiration speeches. Survival came first. Everything else came later. This matters because pain was not an obstacle in Ngannou's life. It was the environment. Long before he learned to throw a punch, he learned how to endure. Long before discipline came from coaches, it came from necessity. When people talk about his power, they often forget where it was forged. Leaving Cameroon was not a heroic decision. It was a desperate one. Ngannou did not leave with sponsors, visas lined up, or promises waiting. He left because staying meant accepting a future that had already been written for him. The journey ahead was unknown, and that uncertainty was still better than certainty at home. Europe did not reward his courage, it punished it. Border crossings failed, arrests followed. He was detained, rejected, and released into streets that did not care whether he survived. Homelessness became routine, hunger became familiar. Nights were spent outside, wondering whether this gamble had already failed. This is where most stories end quietly. This is where ambition dies without witnesses. But something different happened here. The same patience that carried him through the mines carried him through the streets. Ngannou did not romanticize suffering, he endured it. When he finally walked into a gym, it was not love at first sight. Mixed martial arts was not a dream, it was an opportunity that happened to still be open. He was older than most beginners, he was unrefined, he was raw. What stood out was not skill, but potential that could not be ignored. Power changes how people look at you. It changes how quickly doors open. Coaches saw something dangerous and unfinished, something that could either be controlled or explode. Ngannou chose to listen, to learn, to submit himself to structure for the first time in his life. If this story already has you questioning what you thought you knew about Francis Ngannou, subscribe to MMA Arena because this is where the real stories behind MMA actually get told. This section is not about victory, it is about foundation. Because before the knockouts, before the belts, and before the controversy, Francis Ngannou was a man who learned how to survive when quitting would have made sense. And that lesson would shape every decision he made once the world finally started watching. What follows is not a straight climb upward, but a collision between power and control, freedom and authority. The rise begins here, not with fame, but with a man who refuses to disappear quietly.
When Francis Ngannou finally stepped into professional mixed martial arts, the violence came quickly. Not reckless violence, but sudden endings. Fights did not stretch into technical battles, they stopped, often brutally. Opponents came in prepared to test a newcomer and left unsure of what had hit them. His early career was not built on hype, it was built on fear. Matchmakers noticed, promoters noticed, fighters noticed. There was something unsettling about a man who did not celebrate knockouts, who did not taunt, and who did not rush the spotlight. Ngannou finished his opponents and walked away as if nothing unusual had happened. When he entered the UFC, expectations were cautious. Raw power had entered the promotion before, and it had failed just as often as it succeeded. But Ngannou did not just win, he erased people. Luis Enrique, Curtis Blades, Bojan Mihailovic. Each fight reinforced the same message. This was not normal heavyweight power, this was different. The knockouts became highlights, the highlights became viral. Suddenly, the UFC had a problem and an opportunity at the same time. Francis Ngannou was not easy to market. His accent was heavy, his personality was reserved. He did not fit the traditional mold, but violence speaks every language, and his knockouts spoke loudly. With every finish, the narrative shifted. The question was no longer whether he belonged, It was who could possibly stop him. Analysts tried to explain his success through physics, biomechanics, and punch force measurements. Fans didn't need explanations. They felt it when he landed. Yet beneath the destruction was an unfinished fighter. His grappling was still developing. His pacing was untested. His confidence had never been challenged under pressure. These weaknesses were noted quietly, while the knockouts stole the spotlight. This is where the expectations became dangerous. Ngannou was being pushed toward the top faster than his experience suggested, not because he was ready, but because the division needed him. The UFC heavyweight division had lacked fear for too long, and Ngannou restored it overnight. If you're watching this and realizing how fast everything escalated, this is a good moment to pause and subscribe to MMA Arena, because the rise is always exciting, but the cost of rising too fast is where the real story begins. As wins stacked up, pressure followed. Interviews increased, media obligations grew, and slowly, without announcement, the quiet man who once fought for survival found himself fighting expectation. The cage was no longer just a test of skill, it was a stage where mistakes would now be magnified. What comes next is not domination, it is resistance. The moment when power meets preparation and when raw force collides with structure. This is where Francis Ngannou's story stops being about a rival and starts being about consequence.
By the time Francis Ngannou earned a title shot, the conversation around him had become dangerously simple. Power versus everyone else. Knockout or nothing. Each walk to the cage felt shorter. Each fight ended faster, and the myth grew louder than the man himself. But championships are not built on myths. They are built on discipline, patience, and the ability to survive when violence alone is not enough. Across from Ngannou stood Stipe Miocic, a champion who did not fear power because he respected preparation more. From the opening moments, the difference was clear. Miocic did not rush, he did not trade. He studied, he waited, and when Ngannou exploded, Miocic was already moving. The fight became a lesson broadcast to the world. Takedowns, control, exhaustion. Each round drained something Ngannou had never been forced to manage before. His muscles tightened, his breathing slowed. The confidence that had carried him through early knockouts began to fade under sustained pressure. This was not just a physical defeat, it was an exposure. For the first time in his career, Francis Ngannou could not impose his will. He was reacting instead of attacking, chasing instead of controlling. By the later rounds, the power that once terrified opponents became heavy and unusable, locked behind fatigue and frustration. When the final bell sounded, there was no controversy, no excuses. Miocic had dominated him. The scorecards confirmed what everyone watching already knew. The monster had been stopped, not by knockout, but by understanding. What followed was quieter than the rise. No viral highlights, no celebration clips, just questions. Had Ngannou been rushed? Was he overhyped? Could he adapt, or had the blueprint been exposed permanently? In the UFC heavyweight division, patience is rare, and second chances are not guaranteed. This defeat forced Francis Ngannou to confront something he had avoided since his earliest days: limitation. Power had always been enough. Now it wasn't. The path forward required humility, rebuilding, and acceptance that raw strength could no longer carry him alone. This is where many fighters disappear. Some lose confidence, some resist change, some cling to what once worked until it stops working entirely. Ngannou chose differently. He stepped away from the spotlight and into reconstruction. Training became quieter, smarter, less about destruction and more about endurance. If you're still watching at this point, you're witnessing the moment that separates highlight fighters from champions. Stay with MMA Arena, because what came after this loss reshaped not just Ngannou's career, but the power balance of the entire heavyweight division. This defeat did not weaken Francis Ngannou, it refined him. It introduced patience into his violence and purpose into his preparation. And while fans debated whether he could return, the truth was simpler. The most dangerous version of Francis Ngannou had not yet arrived.
Losses do something wins never can. They stay, they replay, they attach names to moments a fighter can't escape. For Francis Ngannou, those names were Stipe Miocic and Derrick Lewis, and each loss cut in a different way. The Miocic defeat exposed his limits. The Derek Lewis fight questioned his instincts. After the title loss, Ngannou was expected to rebound violently. The UFC booked him against Derek Lewis, another heavyweight known for knockout power. On paper, it looked explosive. In reality, it became one of the strangest fights in heavyweight history. Both men hesitated. Both men waited. Neither committed. Ngannou did not lose by damage that night. He lost by indecision. Derek Lewis edged him on the scorecards, and the reaction was brutal. Fans booed. Analysts criticized. Media narratives turned harsh. The same man once praised as unstoppable was now labeled gun-shy, exposed, and mentally broken. This loss hurt differently because it attacked his identity. Against Miocic, he was outclassed. Against Lewis, he was doubted. Questions shifted from skill to courage, from preparation to heart. For a fighter whose journey was built on endurance, this cut deep. Behind the scenes, pressure tightened. Expectations were no longer patient. The UFC heavyweight division had moved on quickly, and Francis Ngannou found himself in an unfamiliar position. Not the hunter, not the favorite, just another contender trying to regain belief. But something changed during this period. Ngannou stopped chasing validation. He stopped trying to prove he was dangerous. Instead, he focused on control, on timing, on understanding when to strike rather than forcing it. The comeback began quietly. Curtis Blades was the first reminder. Jair's Neo-Rozenstruik was the confirmation. In less than a minute, Ngannou returned to form, but this time with restraint. The violence was still there, but it was selective, intentional. Each win erased doubt, but the losses never disappeared. Miocic and Lewis became reference points, not wounds. They shaped how Ngannou trained, how he paced himself, and how he approached pressure. They forced him to accept that fear could exist without weakness. This stretch of his career also planted the seeds of conflict. Ngannou began questioning systems, expectations, and how fighters were valued. He had been rushed, criticized, and dismissed, all while carrying the division's excitement on his back. The relationship between fighter and promotion began to strain quietly, long before it ever became public. If you've followed Francis Ngannou to this point, now is the moment to stay locked in. Subscribe to MMA Arena, because what comes next is not just a redemption story, it's a collision between power, pride, and control. The losses did not define Francis Ngannou, but they changed him, and the man who emerged from them would soon shake the UFC, not just with knockouts, but with resistance.
When Francis Ngannou finally got his second chance at Stipe Miocic, it wasn't just a rematch, it was a referendum on everything people said he wasn't. Calm, coachable, patient. The fight unfolded differently from the first second. Ngannou did not rush. He did not waste energy. He defended takedowns. He measured distance. And when the opening appeared, he ended the fight with authority. The knockout of Stipe Miocic crowned Francis Ngannou as UFC heavyweight champion, but it also marked the beginning of his most complicated battle. Not in the cage, outside of it. As champion, Ngannou expected security, respect, fair negotiation. What he encountered instead was resistance. Contract talks stalled. Negotiations dragged. The UFC, led by Dana White, pushed for long-term control. Ngannou pushed back. He wanted freedom. He wanted fighter pay reform. He wanted the ability to box. These requests were not welcomed. Dana White made his position clear publicly. Fighters fight where and when they are told. Champions are replaceable. The belt belongs to the promotion. Ngannou's stance was painted as ungrateful, risky, naive. Behind the scenes, tension escalated. What made this conflict explosive was timing. Francis Ngannou was at his peak, champion, draw, dangerous, but he was also injured. Knee surgery delayed his return, and instead of protection, he felt pressure. Interim titles were introduced. Other heavyweights were promoted. The message was subtle but sharp. Move on or be moved past.
Despite the injury, Ngannou returned to defend his belt against Cyril Gane. Fighting on one functional knee, he relied on wrestling, control, and will. He won a decision that silenced doubts about his adaptability. But even that victory did not repair the relationship. Contract negotiations collapsed entirely. Dana White publicly stated that Ngannou would not fight in the UFC again. The champion was stripped, not defeated, stripped. The belt moved on without him. This moment divided fans. Some believed Ngannou was standing up for fighters. Others believed he had overplayed his hand. But what was undeniable was this: no UFC champion had ever walked away like this, especially not a heavyweight champion in his prime. If you're still watching, this is where the story stops being just about Francis Ngannou and starts becoming about power, about who controls fighters' careers and what happens when someone refuses to be controlled. Subscribe to MMA Arena if you want stories that go beyond highlights and into the consequences. Francis Ngannou left the UFC with his title intact in spirit, but gone in name. He left behind knockouts, dominance, and controversy, and as the MMA world debated whether he would fade into irrelevance, he was already preparing to redefine what freedom looked like for a fighter at the highest level. What followed shocked everyone.
Francis Ngannou didn't disappear. He stepped into unknown territory. And what happens next changes everything: his career, the sport, and the balance of power. Part 2 picks up where the UFC story ends, and where most fighters are never allowed to go. Subscribe now, because when Part 2 drops, you won't want to hear about it later. You'll want to witness it unfold in real time.